Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to the British Library. My name is Uli Lennart, and I'm a bookseller at Gazewer Bookshop, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event for Some Men in London, Queer Life 1945 to 67, with editor Peter Parker in conversation with the one and only Neil Bartlett. And I'd especially like to extend the warmest welcome to all of our online viewers who are joining us remotely tonight. You're very, very welcome here. This evening, there will be around 60 minutes of conversation and readings, and then Peter and Neil will be taking questions from you guys in-house and remotely from our online audiences. If you're watching in live time online, please submit the questions using the question box, which is below the video. And for our audience in the theatre tonight, simply raise your hand, and if you're selected to ask a question, the mic will find its way to you. Just a couple of housekeeping points. For the audience in the auditorium, please do turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent. Please check those now, I'd appreciate it. We are not expecting any fire alarms this evening, but if one is heard, it's quite likely a legitimate emergency, so please follow the emergency exit lights and make your way out. There will be book sales after the event, as there were beforehand, and Peter and Neil will be signing in the foyer. The online audience, you can get a copy of the book by clicking on the Books tab, which is the top of the page, and you can get copies through that via Gazewer Bookshop. It's a very good bookshop. Drawing upon letters, diaries, novels, plays, films, newspaper articles, parliamentary debate, medical journals, and police reports, Peter Parker's impressive two-volume anthology provides a picture of what life was really like for gay men from the end of the Second World War to the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in '67. Although these men faced persecution in the courts and vilification in the newspapers, they showed extraordinary resilience, and the capital had a lively queer subculture that informed the arts in a very profound and important way. Before I welcome Peter and Neil to the stage, I'd just like to say a few words about just how extraordinarily important I think these two volumes are, and the precious fragmented glimpses they give us into the real lived experiences of gay men in post-war London. One of the great many privileges of working at Gaze the Word is meeting people, of interacting with members of our community from across the generations. Over the course of the last 20 years, I have had the honor of getting to know a number of truly astonishing people. Men like Arthur, men like Ron and Frank, Amber, Michael, and my beloved Ron Wright. They told me stories of what life was like in London and other parts of the country when they were young men in the 1950s and 1960s. They shared with me both the hilarity and, perhaps in a quieter voice, the heartbreak. For these were often wounding, hostile times. For many of these men, the experiences they went through, they didn't necessarily want to relive or discuss in great detail, but the illusion was there. Its presence was felt. All these men were special, wonderful, beautiful, incredible human beings, and there would come a time where I would have to say goodbye to them all. Jim, my colleague, and I would attend their funerals and hear even more surprising stories about them from their families and their loved ones. I would often unpack the books that these men bequeathed to Gaze the Word, tracing the outline of their lives from the books that they read. So tonight's event, and these two volumes that we're all here for this evening, are for those men, and they are for all of us, the young and the old. They are a precious insight into what these men negotiated, the lows, highs, and the everyday in between. So back to tonight. This evening, Neil Bartlett and Peter Parker will explore the entire post-war period, but with particular emphasis on the 1960s, with readings from letters, diaries, and other documents. Peter Parker, as you all know, I'm sure, is a celebrated biographer, essayist, and editorial contributor. And Neil Bartlett is a writer, director, culture maker, and for me personally, a guiding light Please join me in welcoming them both to the stage. Thank you, everyone.
Well, hello, good evening. My name's Neil, and this is my friend Peter.
Good evening.
Good, you got it. I thought, what will happen if I do that and there's complete and utter silence? So, welcome to our bijou latte here in the British Library, and how bona it is to see your dolly oldie, Peter. So, Heartface, we are here to celebrate the completion of this mammoth achievement, your 2 volumes of primary source material of our history, some Omies in London. First question, why did you choose that pregnant phrase for your title?
Well, it was one of those things, it's like a lot of things that happen, it's just by accident. On the contract, it was called Men in London, 1945 to 1967, because in those far-off days, it was only going to be 1 volume. And I'd always not really cared for it. And so at some crucial point, when I thought my editor might not be thinking about anything else, I said, can we just think again about the title? And he came up and he said, what about just very casually, Some Men in London? And I think it's actually perfect because it's not emphatic. It's just, here are some men in London. There are lots of other men in London, but here are some of them, and this is what they were doing, and this is what they were thinking, feeling, watching. So it's casual, I think.
I think it's perfect for all of the reasons that you've said. This must have been a labour of love in a very real sense. I mean, I think at one stage it was twice as long. Is that
Well,
true?
I think Simon, my editor, is here. He'll probably say yes. No, I don't think it was twice as long. And it was longer. There were a lot of material had to go. We particularly cut quite a lot of fiction because it's very difficult to extract from a novel without having so much commentary that there's no room left for the novels themselves. There was a lot of stuff that we couldn't use because it cost too much to reproduce, or we were refused permission by libraries or individuals or estates. But it came in at twice the length that it was commissioned, and Simon was fairly horrified, but held his nerve.
Right.
And we did a lot of cutting, and then he just said, actually, if we cut any more, we're going to wreck it, so let's do 2 volumes. And I was worried if we did 2 volumes sort of a year apart, which would be the usual thing. It's one story to me, and to have it split, and because the whole book is arranged chronologically, even though you can sort of separate off the 60s quite nicely, I think it would have spoilt the momentum. And so when Simon said, oh, well, we can do it a couple of months apart, I thought, well, that's perfect. So that's what we did.
It must have been a labour of love. I mean, you spent an enormous amount. How long has it taken?
A mere 6 years.
A mere 6 years.
Yeah, but you see, it took me 12 years to write a biography of Christopher Isherwood, so this seems like a doddle. It's a sprint compared
to spend 6 years, perhaps particularly with this epoch of our history, it's a mammoth undertaking, and it must at times have been quite emotionally hard to spend the hours and hours burrowing into this material.
Yes, because it covers all sorts of aspects of queer life at that period, and a lot of it is not very happy making. I think you sort of just you look for things and you get attuned to what you're looking for, and I was determined right from the start that this wasn't going to be sort of a particularly, I wanted to get in all the alien voices, the people who were saying, we should all be eliminated and exterminated, alongside those who were saying, come on, we've got to fight for our rights. So getting that balance was very important for me. it was a lot of being immersed in various archives. There are some very good archives around, like the Bishopsgate Institute, which has the wonderful lesbian and gay newspaper archive, which indeed saved me a lot of time, because otherwise I was going onto the British newspaper archive online and typing in some dates and putting in homosexual and seeing what came up, which is a bit of an arbitrary way of doing it, though in fact it did bring up quite a lot, except of course that particularly in the earlier period, if someone was up in court for homosexual offences, it would say a serious offence, so the word homosexual wouldn't appear in the newspapers. But the difficulty was keeping it focused on London. We right from the beginning, we thought it has to be London, because if it was the whole country, it would be absolutely vast. I mean, it's vast enough as it is. You certainly don't want any more of it. And also, London was it was the barometer. So what was happening in London was also happening elsewhere. Yeah. And although the Wolfenden report into homosexuality and prostitution that the Commission in 1954 and the Wolfenden report in 1957, although they did take witnesses from all around the country, most of the stuff that they processed was from London. It's that usual thing. London does, rule, and it still does. But it is sort of representative. So, for example, the two policemen working on the Vice Squad that they introduced were two London bobbies, and they're in Volume 1, and their witness is absolutely amazing, partly because it was not a written thing, it was just a stenographer was noting it down. So it's absolutely what they really thought. And so I found all that material fascinating.
I think that's one of the great virtues of the two volumes, is that there's a very real sense of hearing the past as opposed to reading the past. Often you found voices. A brutally simple question, why? Why, and why now? Why did you feel compelled to do this memorializing and making accessible this particular part of our history? Because it has a very specific function just at the moment. It's just on the edge of memory. I mean, how many people here remember the night when the law changed, for instance? Yeah. So a significant number, but not masses of us. So we all acknowledge this is just about to go into history with a capital H. In other words, that stuff you can only find out about via books, as opposed to asking someone. How did that sense inform your process?
Well, I decided right from the beginning that I would only put in the book anything that had been written or said at the time. So I didn't go around and talk to a lot of elderly gay men about their memories, because I wanted it to give an impression of what it was like to live through this era. So I didn't want hindsight. I mean, hindsight can be very valuable, and there are marvellous memoirs by gay men of these times. But I wanted it to be absolutely what it would be like living through the period. So I think it's also, I was very much aware that it's an era that is sort of becoming forgotten. You say it's on that sort of cusp of history, and it's just on the edge of living memory. And these things do disappear, and I think particularly now that we all have rights enshrined by law, we can get married. These would seem inconceivable to most of the people in the book, and I think that particularly people who are growing up now and enjoying these freedoms, I wanted to remind them that they didn't just appear, that these were fought for. And people, really went in there and argued the case. And also, I think it's very useful to know, I know in this age of the internet, people are very worried about being upset. But actually, I think Ackley, who I wrote a biography, J.R. Ackley, the editor of The Listener and memoirist himself, said that, he said, to speak the truth, I think people ought to be upset, because I think life is so important, and in its working so upsetting, nobody should be spared. And actually, I think we need to remember the sort of terrible things that were said about gay people in the past, not least because we don't want to repeat it. And I think that's a sort of one of the messages of the book. I mean, it's making it sound terribly serious because, also I wanted...
We'll get to the laughs later. Okay, we will.
But I mean, someone actually said to me after, when the first volume came out, someone who wasn't actually that young, probably in their 30s or 40s, said, do you know, I had absolutely no idea that in the 40s and 50s there were gay bars and there were gay clubs. I didn't know people had so much sex. And I thought, actually, well, if you didn't know, I'm glad you know now. That was one of my missions.
Speaking of what we were hard up against, let's begin one of our readings. So Peter and I had a lot of fun going through the books and going, shall we do this bit? Shall we do that bit? And we've got a selection of bits that we've decided we're going to take it in turns to read pieces. I think these are actually all from the second volume, because that's the volume that's just come out and completing the set. So we thought, let's go for that, go for the 60s. So you talked about people who said really awful things about us. So trigger warning. The shit is really just about to hit the fan. And it's shit of the worst kind, highly educated and entitled. So you're going to read the first couple of pieces that we've chosen. Could you tell us just briefly who is responsible for this hideousness and anything we need to know about them? What year are we in?
Well, the first piece is July 1960. I mean, it sounds like the Dark Ages. And it's Lady Lloyd, who was Georgette H. Lloyd. And I'm very happy to say I've been able to find out absolutely nothing about her. She's disappeared. Yes! She's vanished from history. But you have to recognise that this is 3 years after the Wolfenden Report was published. So, homosexuality is very much in the news. And there was a sort of, people were wanting it to be implemented, and the government, as usual, were dragging their heels. But of course, for some people, this was wonderful, and do we really need to talk about it at all? So here is Lady Lloyd writing to the Daily Telegraph on the 5th of July, 1960.
Can we just say that again? The Daily Telegraph. Thank you. Yes.
Sir, your leader on homosexuality of June 30th deserves the gratitude of all your readers. Quote, a shudder should not be turned into a shrug. There you have pinpointed the danger which might attend the legislation. Let us hope that soon some termination will be achieved of this unceasing recurrence in the public press of the horrible subject. Degrading practices cannot be stopped by lawmaking. The dignity of man is inherent, not a law-made quality. All decent people long to see a cessation of the discussion. Behind a drawn blind, a corpse may be rotting. The blind will not stop the smell, but at least it will hide from the passer-by the horrors of putrefaction. Yours faithfully, Georgette H. Lloyd.
Oh, we laugh, of course, but I'm sure I don't need to point out you could take that letter, change very little of the wording, and send it to the Daily Telegraph if the corpse was trans rights, and they would publish it, especially while the Tory leadership contest is taking up their front pages. Call me bitter, but I think that's true. You thought that was bad. Pin back your luggoles. Go on. Let's hear the next one.
Well, we now move into the Houses of Parliament. And it is quite extraordinary, the things that were said. We're not going to have Lord Montgomery of Alamein, who Noel Coward said sounded absolutely deranged. But how could he have commanded men and not know nothing about them? This is June 1960. I may say, just as a way of introduction, that the Wolfenden Report was published in 1958. The government didn't get round even to debating it until over a year later. And in fact, believe it or not, the Lords led the way, and the Lords actually debated it much earlier, but the government was terrified that this was going to be a subject that was going to lose them elections. Kenneth Robinson, who was the Labour MP for St Pancras North, introduced the Commons debate on the Wolfenden report, and this is in 1960. Various people stood up to talk. One was Geoffrey Lagden, Conservative, Hornchurch. Over the last few months, many ON members have been inundated from many sources with literature under the cover of stating facts, has, in my view, endeavoured to influence our opinions and to state the case for the homosexual. In my opinion, all right-thinking people would at best, and I put it at best, think of these homosexuals as people with warped minds who have little self-control. I contend that that is the best one can say for them. Let us consider what literature has been trying to do. It has largely been suggesting that the homosexual is quite a nice chap. The suggestion is, do not be frightened of him, he's really a decent chap. Let us not be too legal about these things and not too prudish about them. In my opinion, in the general run, the homosexual is a dirty-minded danger to the virile manhood of this country. The Right Honourable Lady Member for Warrington laughs, but it is important for any country to have a virile manhood and to see that it is not corrupted by men such as these.
I couldn't possibly comment on that last bit. This is my horror. This is from a book by Richard Hauser, who published in 1962 a book called The Homosexual Society, which I would recommend for its contents list alone. The demoralized married man is one, the self-isolating homosexual, the fully sublimated homosexual, who I have yet to meet. And he conducted many interviews. I don't think we have much information about how he got to his interviewees, but this is one. It's very short, and it conceals an entire wasteland of horror and violence. This person being interviewed doesn't have an exact age, but he's a teenager. He says, "When I was a youngster, we used to have a lot of fun by letting some geezer do things, and then we'd say to him, 'Mister, you'd better pay up, see, or we go over to the next copper and tell him you tried to do something dirty to us.' Well, you should have seen their faces. Red and green, I tell you, they got. One old geezer, he knelt down in front of me and asked me for his wife's sake and kids' sake, please don't do it. And then he gave me a whole bundle of pound notes and his watch. I tell you, I laugh for days." Yes, well, that is the lived reality that's under those extraordinary pronouncements in the letters page of the Telegraph and the House of Lords. Of course, blackmail was one of the major narratives in the argument for legal reform, was that we can't continue to have laws that make people like you and I constant prey to blackmailer. Most notably, that argument was the spine of Janet Green's screenplay for Victim, Green and McCormack, 61?
61, yes.
Which film is still doing the rounds. Peter, cue your plug.
Peter, anyone who hasn't had enough this evening, on October the 14th, there's going to be a screening of Victim at the Garden Cinema, and I will be in a Q&A afterwards with Mendes, and we shall be talking about the film. And there was obviously a lot about the film I couldn't get into the book. There's quite a bit about the film in the book, but it was this sort of landmark film that was really a thriller, but it was work of proselytism as well, and written by a husband and wife, and they wanted to produce a film that tackled the problem of homosexuality. So they made a thriller, and it was the thriller in which Dirk Bogarde plays a married lawyer, a married barrister, who is nevertheless gay and has been involved with another man. And he is determined to smash a ring of blackmailers. And it's actually an amazing film, and it stands up very well indeed, I think.
And it does include the immortal line, whatever else you think about Doak Bogard, he says right in the heart of the film, yes, I wanted him. And I think for a lot of people at the time, and even for some people like me, for instance, since, that moment really cuts through. And if you watch it carefully, Bogard is sweating in that shot. And movie stars, which he was, never sweated on camera in that period. But what was happening and he would have had approval on that take?
He actually insisted. He, in fact, emphasized, because I think originally in the script it says, I wanted him. And he said, we got to repeat it, I wanted him, I tell you, I wanted him. And the censor wasn't terribly pleased about it, but they did let it through. It's a fascinating story about how the British Board of Film Censors, as it was then, it's now the British Board of Film Classification, actually worked with filmmakers. So they would have the proposal for the film, then they'd have a treatment, then they'd have a script, and at each stage, the secretary, John Trevelyan, would say, I don't think you can get away with this. I think you can do that. And you can't. I mean, he did once famously say there are rather too many homosexuals in this film, which he was actually a great man in his way, but it does seem a sort of slightly naive objection to a film on this subject.
It's certainly by no means the first film or British film that has a homosexual or homosexuals in it. It has a unique claim to fame. It's the first British film in which there are only homosexuals on screen. There's one brief scene in a very uptight gentleman's club, in inverted commas, with 5 characters, and they're all homosexual. And that was the first time we'd filled the whole screen.
And quite a few of the actors, including Bogard, of course. There's a wonderful piece about how they made me act a homosexual in some sort of fan magazine that I put the extract in there, which is very funny indeed. It sort of said, Dirk Bogard is a perfectly normal man, has the right number of hormones, and he's really taking a risk. And I mean, he did take a risk, actually. Hats off to Bogard. It was a risky strategy, but it did come off.
When I came out to my father, he was furious about many things, but 2 things in particular. Dirk Bogard. He was so cross when I told him that Dirk Bogard was gay. And then the thing that made him leave the room was George Chakiris. Because my father was a huge fan of West Side Story, and he just went, no, don't be ridiculous, and left the room. Oh well, we got through that one. Let's move on to, as it were, the other side, our voices, as opposed to their voices. One thing, a thought that I really don't know what to do with, but that was provoked by this book. We hear, and I noticed that Uli did it too, and where are you, darling? No disrespect, we all do it. But it always says, in the 50s and 60s, life was really terrible when we were illegal. Despite this, we had a marvelous time. I just wonder if it shouldn't be entirely the other way round. In the 50s and 60s, we were as rich, complex, normal, extraordinary, sexual as anybody else, and despite this, they tried to make laws against us. I just wonder sometimes if we should turn the whole thing upside down. I'd like to read something in which the world is the other way up. This is an extract from a novel I'd never even heard of, a novelist called Frank Norman, 1960. And it's a thinly fictionalized account of his time in the nightlife of Soho. He invents a fictional club called the 86. I can't think of a queer club in Soho that had a number as its name that it's based on.
No, I think it's generic. I think it's not. I mean, there are lots of novels with gay clubs that are sort of generic, though perhaps based on.
As you know, darlings, they're all the same. This is just an encounter with someone who's living under the law, but seems entirely uncensored, it seems to me. The queers and leses that you get in that club are of a very dodgy variety and couldn't be much camper if they tried. I was having a rabbit with an old queen the other day. To tell the truth, the only reason I was chatting to her because I thought there might be some slight chance I could con her out of a fiver. She'd been around for years and was known to one and all as Peach. She had her boat all done up with slap. Translation, boat race face, slap makeup, and a barnet fair hair, also known as raya, certainly in my house. Her barnet was grey and had a blue rinse. Stand on me, she was very bold. Love it. I want that on my tombstone, darling. She was very bold. Hello, you dirty old whore, I said, and ran my fingers through her barnet as I sat down on the chair next to her. Don't you talk to me like that, she replied in an effeminate tone of voice. Surely not. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I said. Anyhow, we camped around for a bit and somehow the conversation took a suddenly serious note. How this happened, I don't have no idea. But I remember I wound up asking her how she first found out she was queer and one thing and another. And in reply to my question, she said, when I was 16, I was a very ugly looking boy. And then one day I went to bed with a man. And you know, when I woke up the next morning, I changed into a beautiful girl. I love this queen. As we talked, another character called Bill came in and sat down at the table next to us. He didn't take any notice because he was reading a book. Hello, welcome. And after a while, he looked up from his book and he said, oh, it's terrible, it's shocking what's in here, I'm shocked. And then he went back to reading the book. You don't have to go on about it, shouted the Peach. And Bill looked, I love it's the Peach, not Peach, shouted the Peach. Bill looked up from his book again. Eerie says, I wasn't talking to you. Now then, I said, don't you two, let's not have any bother. Bother spelt B-O-V-V-A. It's all very real in here. If you must know, says Bill, I was just thinking aloud about something I'd just read about in this book. It's all about the war, about concentration camps. And I have to say, I'm finding it all very shocking. Well, replied the Peach, if you ask me, darling, there should be a lot less concentration and a lot more camps. So next time someone says, oh, it must have been so dreadful, just thrust a copy of Volume 2 straight in their face. It's on page 30.
I mean, the interesting thing about that is that Frank Norman was heterosexual. I mean, but he was moved in that Soho world where nobody really cared very much. And Neil read it absolutely beautifully, because if you try and read it on the page, it's quite hard, because he was a Borstal boy. He'd had no real education. And he wrote a piece about his upbringing, and it was published in Encounter by Stephen Spender. And Spender took the decision not to alter the punctuation, to not change the spelling, authenticity. And actually, of course, it comes across terribly well. But I think it's a book that I can't remember how I came across it, but it also has, what date is it?
60.
And it has a description of a gay wedding in it, just after that, which is in the book, which is astonishing. I mean, it's very much not, now is the sort of the sober type of wedding, but this is sort of people, the bride is dressed as a bride and the groom is not much butcher. But it is an extraordinary, and I think it's very interesting to get an outsider's view by someone who is actually very sympathetic and just thought, oh, well, it's Soho.
At the other end of the literary spectrum entirely, this is the next one. Just tell us where this one
This is
comes
Forster, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just make sure I'm on the right page so I don't read
You
something
are,
entirely irrelevant. Yes, of course, Ian Forster has had a lot of stick for not publishing Morris, his gay novel, until after his death. But in fact, he was someone who wrote endless letters to the newspapers and magazines about changing the law. And he gave vast amounts of money to the Homosexual Law Reform Society, thousands of pounds, according to Anthony Gray, who was the secretary. But anyway, at the same time, he was writing in his locked diary, which at the time was literally, it had a lock on it, and it's where he wrote the things that were sort of closest to him, but weren't things that he wanted anyone else necessarily to read. But he also wrote a fragmentary memoir about his earliest sexual experiences, which is very frank and all about falling in love with the boot boy when he was a child himself. And this was written in the 1920s, and he would take it out occasionally and add to it. And in 1963, he took it out and just wrote under it, adding, "When I am nearly 85, how annoyed I am with society for wasting my time for making homosexuality criminal. The subterfuges, the self-consciousnesses that might have been avoided."
I think that's amazing, and I think those few sentences speak such wisdom. The most infuriating thing about it is the waste of time. Think of the lives that could have been led. Forster was writing in a locked diary. Other people were finding other ways to communicate. I don't know if you subscribe to this particular magazine. Anyone? Films and Filming. Films and Filming was basically a front. I mean, look at that cover. Peter said, "Which one do you want?" I said, "Are you kidding?" Paul Newman in Nud. And it was famous for its personal ads, which were printed on slightly pink paper in the middle. And again, I think this is a useful corrective that your book wonderfully gives to the idea that the law had blanket access to our minds or our lives. We're going to read you a little selection of personal ads from the early 1960s from Films and Filming. Peter, you go first.
Pleasant young man required weekly in young designer's flat. Must be willing to do anything from floor scrubbing to bed making. Friendly atmosphere. Full details, box 313F.
Bachelor 28 with own cottage, I kid you not. Close to magnificent secluded beach near Auckland, New Zealand. She gets around. Is willing to share with others at weekends. Visiting sailors and seamen particularly welcome. Photo appreciated.
Undisciplined bachelor, 35, living in Glasgow, would like to meet, correspond with strong-minded persons of either sex with a modern outlook.
A couple of hundred masculine strides along Elizabeth Street from the BOAC Air Terminal, Victoria, is London's first gallery of male plumage, Kavanagh Coventry. That was the name of the fashion company. Here you can browse through a selection of clothes reflecting all that is up to date in the fashion masculine, featuring casuals by Vince. Vince was the biggest knicker manufacturer in gay culture. There's a particular fabulous edition of their catalogue with Sean Connery on the cover, my friends tell me.
Motorcyclist, 30, but novice, seeks further instruction and would also particularly like to contact a water sports trainer. Photo appreciated.
Wanted, Stills, photos, books, magazines, articles, absolutely anything dealing with Cliff Richard.
I mean, it was such a wonderful magazine, and it was run by this man called Philip Doss, and he had plays and players and music and musicians, and alas, committed suicide, not because he was gay, that he was, but the company went bust. But it really was. I mean, I remember reading it in the 70s, and every issue had some male star with very little clothes on, usually Helmut Berger in my period, but or, you know, there were spreads of films that you'd never normally see. Fortune in Men's Eyes,
yeah.
You know, these sort of films. It was an absolutely wonderful magazine.
And now for something completely different, as well as that kind of deeply heartening camp nonsense. The anthology also gives us very necessary glimpses straight inside people's hearts, because the law was all about controlling bodies. They forgot bodies only really work well when the heart is involved. I know this was something you really wanted to include tonight, Peter. This is a passage from the diary of the painter, Vaughan. And amongst all that misery and noise, it's an extraordinary evocation of tenderness and desire.
Well, Keith Vaughan was one of those, I mean, he's a wonderful painter, and he repainted queer desire mainly, pictures of men, not necessarily explicit, but some were explicit, particularly his drawings. And, you know, absolute perfect pedigree. Christopher Isherwood bought a Keith Vaughan to give to E.M. Forster. So we sort of see where he was. As well as being a great painter, he was a fantastic diarist, and his diaries are all in the Tate Britain. Some volumes of his diaries have been published, but only a very small fraction of them. And so I went and read some of them, and they are fantastic. And like a lot of gay men of the period, like J.R. Ackley and E.M. Forster and John Lehman, he liked a bit of rough, and often his bit of rough was so rough that they ended up in prison. And I think the piece you're going to read is about him thinking of Johnny, who was his muse. He was a model. He picked him up and he became his model. And so he had very distinctive features that appear in a lot of the paintings.
I thought you were going to read this bit.
Oh, well, I will read it if you want. No.
I think you should, because it means so much to you, I know.
Well, if you can find the page number.
It's page 172.
What is it? Page 172. Okay.
It's when
Right.
Johnny's in Pentonville.
Okay.
So this is about a young man called Johnny Walsh, who Vaughan had an on complete infatuation with. And when Vaughan writes this entry in the diary, Johnny's back in Jug.
Yeah, he was not in Jug for homosexual offences. He was a sort of small-time criminal, so it was burglary and things like that. And Johnny in Pentonville, now, this moment, asleep. Someone, one of the few I have loved, rightly or wrongly, but whose image, memory, smell, touch, I can recall instantly at any moment of my life. It was 10 years ago, more or less, but there were moments of incomparable rapture. Maybe I invented them, never mind. For me, they were real, were and are real, can never be forgotten or repeated or superseded. Dear, sweet Johnny, how much I loved you, how much I treasured and feared your presence and my love. But those moments of rapturous response, not sexual but physical, when my heart burst and flooded a whole territory of experience which I had never dreamt could be real, that I dreamt but never lived. And I don't believe I invented it. Only a few weeks ago, you recalled an instance when I laughed at your invented word, fleesome, which I would not have thought you could possibly remember so long. But perhaps in such moments, one communicates something, some level of feeling which fuses, which welds like metal, two persons together, at that one point of no importance and can never be broken. Why else should he recall what I thought I shared with no one? how mistrustful I am, but of no importance because it cannot support anything else but itself. It cannot be built on. It cannot make the foundations of friendship. It cannot help or pardon. But it is all I know of love. 13778, Walsh J.W. Dear sweet Johnny.
Thank you for bringing that to the table, Peter. So often, in my experience, younger people talk to me about difference, about the distance of the past. Oh gosh, everything's changed. Back in your day, etc., etc. And one of the things I think makes the form of anthology is really good for our history, because instead of following an argument, you're picking through the rubble, and then something winks at you. That phrase in that entry about something that welds two pieces of metal into a joint that can't be broken. What's old-fashioned about that? What's different about that? One of the things that the anthology radically communicates is, I feel, not Georgette or whatever, I couldn't bring myself to talk to her in the first place, but there are so many people in this anthology I feel I could sit down with and begin the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, talking about bringing it sort of a bit more up to date, Derek Jarman, there's an entry in one of his diaries saying that he was reading Keith Vaughan's journals, and he said, I feel such an affinity with this man. And I think that is that thing of being carried down the generations, and there are perhaps more, we're talking about a time where things were a lot more difficult, but I still think there are affinities as well, and there's a sort of that reaching across the centuries of these people reaching out to us and us reaching back.
I find the easiest way to cut through that with younger people is to say, so do you find it easy now everything's changed? I've never met one who says yes. I've never met someone who said, oh yeah, it's great, it's fine, everything's groovy. No. And that sense of estrangement is still being played out. One of the things that really gets my goat when people talk about this period exactly, people who